Friday night, March 31st, 2006. Columbus, Ohio. Spring break has just begun at Ohio State University, and High Street, the beating heart of campus nightlife, is coming alive. Bars are filling. Music spills out onto the sidewalk. It's the kind of night this stretch of the city was built for. Thousands of students, freed from exams for the first time in weeks, moving between bars, restaurants, and late-night food carts under a canopy of neon signs. Inside the South Campus Gateway complex, one bar is packed shoulder to shoulder. It's called the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a loud, unmistakably collegiate spot reached by riding an escalator up to the second floor. Among the crowd that night is a 27-year-old second-year medical student named Brian Shaffer. Security cameras, installed because the area carried a higher-than-average crime rate at the time, capture him arriving. They capture him riding the escalator up to the bar. They capture him laughing with friends, a young man in the middle of an ordinary Friday night, in a bar he'd been to many times before. 3 days later, when Brian still hasn't turned up, his family reports him missing. Detectives do exactly what you'd expect, they pull the surveillance tape. Detectives thought the cameras had recorded the answer. They hadn't. In fact, those recordings became the biggest obstacle to solving the case. Nearly 20 years later, investigators still cannot explain what happened after Brian stepped out of frame. To understand why this case has haunted investigators for nearly 20 years, you have to understand what Brian Shaffer was walking away from, because by every measure, he wasn't walking away from anything at all. Brian grew up in Pickerington, a quiet suburb east of Columbus, the elder of Randy and Renee Shaffer's 2 sons. By the spring of 2006, he was a second-year student at the Ohio State University College of Medicine, clean-cut, athletic, high-achieving, the kind of son a family points to with quiet pride. But that wasn't the whole story. Brian loved music every bit as much as medicine. He wore a Pearl Jam tattoo on his upper arm, and friends said he talked, more than once, about wanting to start a band of his own someday. Early in 2006, he'd begun a serious relationship with a fellow second-year medical student, Alexis Wagoner. Their families believed it was heading somewhere permanent, that Brian intended to propose during a trip the couple had already booked to Miami, set to begin just 2 days after that Friday night out. Just 3 weeks earlier, the future doctor who planned to propose in Miami had lost his mother, Renee, to a rare blood cancer. Friends said he was grieving, but he wasn't withdrawing. He was still looking forward to that trip. He was still planning his future. So when Brian sat down to dinner with his father on the last Friday of March, 2006, to mark the start of spring break, he was, by all accounts, a young man with more reason than most to want to stay exactly where he was. Less than 6 hours later, Brian would be seen alive for the final time. No one standing beside him realized it. The evening began with family. Brian met his father, Randy, for dinner at an Outback Steakhouse in Reynoldsburg, on the east side of the city. Randy thought his son looked exhausted, worn down from an all-night study session ahead of upcoming exams. Privately, he wondered whether Brian should really go out that night at all. He didn't say anything. It's a small, ordinary moment of parental hesitation, and one Randy would carry with him for the rest of his life. After dinner, Brian met his close friend and former roommate, William Clint Florence, at the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Around 10 p.m., Brian called Alexis, who had traveled to her family's home in Toledo ahead of their trip, a short, warm call, confirming their flight, their plans, nothing more. From there, Brian and Florence spent the night bar-hopping through the Arena District and the Short North before circling back, sometime after midnight, with a friend of Florence's named Meredith Reed, who offered them a ride back toward campus for one more stop. At 1:15 a.m., security cameras captured all 3 of them riding the escalator up to the Ugly Tuna Saloona together, for what would turn out to be the final stretch of the bar's night. At some point in the next 40 minutes, in that crowded room, Brian got separated from his friends, nothing unusual, nothing that would have alarmed anyone, in a bar that packed on the first night of spring break. 1:55 a.m. 5 minutes until closing. It's the last point in Brian Shaffer's life investigators can place him with certainty. By 2 a.m., the bar closes. Florence and Reed step outside with the departing crowd, expecting Brian to follow. He isn't there. They call his phone. No answer. Eventually they land on the only explanation that makes sense in the moment, that Brian had simply found his own way home, and they leave. What Florence and Reed didn't know that night was that investigators would later determine the last confirmed public sighting of their friend had already been captured on tape. What detectives were about to see would transform an ordinary missing person case into one of America's strangest disappearances. Saturday passed with no word from Brian. Unusual, but not alarming. Monday changed that. Brian was supposed to be boarding a flight to Miami with Alexis that morning, a trip he'd confirmed with her by phone just hours before he disappeared. He never showed. Alexis and Randy reported him missing to the Columbus Division of Police. Detectives went back to the last place Brian was confirmed to be. The South Campus Gateway complex had an unusually thorough security camera system for 2006, coverage across its entrances, its exits, and the escalators connecting them. Detectives pulled the tape. At first, nothing looked unusual. Clear footage of Brian, Florence, and Reed riding the escalator together at 1:15 a.m. And then, at approximately 1:55 a.m., one more frame, the one that would define this entire case. Brian, standing just outside the bar's entrance, talking with two young women he'd apparently met that night, later identified as Brighton Zatko and Amber Ruick. At first, detectives believed these two women might solve the entire case outright. They were the very last known people to speak with Brian before he disappeared. They couldn't. Both women would later tell reporters they weren't even asked by police to take a polygraph. In the footage, Brian says goodbye. He turns. He takes a few steps. He reaches the edge of the frame. And disappears. At first, detectives expected him to walk back into view, the way anyone does, in a crowded room, when they've simply stepped just out of shot for a moment. He never did. That is the last confirmed image ever captured of Brian Shaffer. He does not reappear on that camera. Not seconds later, not minutes later. Not at all. What happened next made even experienced investigators pause, because that camera was only one of several covering the building that night. And detectives were about to discover a second exit from that building they hadn't fully accounted for yet. It's become a kind of internet legend that Brian vanished from a building with no possible way out, that the Ugly Tuna Saloona was effectively a sealed box, and Brian simply evaporated somewhere inside it. That version of the story isn't accurate. The building had a little-known service exit beside an area under active construction at the time. Brian's final confirmed appearance on camera placed him only feet away from it. The problem was the cameras covering it weren't continuous. One panned automatically. The other was manually controlled by building security, meaning its actual coverage at any given second depended entirely on where an operator happened to be pointing it. If Brian passed through that camera's blind spot at precisely the wrong moment, or slipped through the service door while no one happened to be watching that angle, there might be no footage of him leaving at all. If Brian had walked out onto High Street through the main entrance, a camera on the street might reasonably have picked him up. They checked surveillance footage from 3 nearby bars, hoping one of those cameras had caught him somewhere outside. None had. Nothing. Not one frame, anywhere. That wasn't the strangest discovery. Investigators have always been careful to separate documented fact from internet myth on this point. They've said it's possible Brian left through that service exit. They've said it's possible he changed his appearance before leaving. What they've never said, what has never been confirmed by any footage made public in nearly 20 years, is that Brian is actually visible leaving the building, by any route, at any point that night. A retired homicide detective who spent years studying that footage put it a specific way: as best investigators could determine, they were able to account for virtually every patron they expected to identify leaving the building that night. Brian could not be definitively placed among them. By this point, detectives had quietly settled into one of two working possibilities. Either Brian had slipped past every camera through sheer bad luck of timing, or he had never left the building alive at all. If Brian really did leave through that service door, why couldn't detectives find a single trace that he'd ever been there? If Brian had never left the building, detectives believed they were about to prove it. Police searched the building floor by floor. Crawl spaces were opened. Maintenance panels covering hidden access points were unscrewed and inspected one at a time. The roof was checked. The construction zone beside the service exit was combed over piece by piece. No trace that Brian had ever been anywhere in that structure after 1:55 a.m. That result cut both ways. It didn't prove Brian had left the building. But it also didn't support the darkest version of events, that something had happened to him inside those walls and his body had simply gone unnoticed. Everything police had relied on to crack this case quickly, the cameras, the eyewitnesses, the building itself, had failed. From this point forward, the investigation would become less about finding a breakthrough and more about eliminating possibilities, one exhausting lead at a time. While detectives searched buildings, sewers, and rooftops, Alexis Waggoner was searching for something much smaller. A phone call. Every night, before bed, she dialed Brian's number. Not because she expected an answer. Because it was the only thing left that felt like doing something. Most nights, it rang once and went straight to voicemail. She'd hang up and try again the next night. And the night after that. With the building offering no answers, detectives turned their attention to the people who had actually been standing next to Brian that night. What they got back from those interviews would end up dividing his own family for years to come. Randy Shaffer volunteered for a polygraph and passed. Every other person investigators asked did the same, every single person, except one. Clint Florence declined to take a polygraph when it was first requested, and again in follow-up requests over the years that followed. Florence has never been named a suspect. He has never been charged with anything connected to Brian's disappearance. His attorney has said publicly that Florence answered every question investigators ever asked him and simply saw no reason to sit for a test whose results generally aren't admissible in court anyway. Polygraph refusal is not evidence of guilt under the law. But for a grieving family searching for any thread to hold on to, it became one of the very few threads available. Brian's brother, Derek, and Alexis both said publicly, in the years that followed, that they found the repeated refusal difficult to reconcile. Alexis's father, who took part in the search himself, has said he came to believe that any real progress on the case would ultimately run through Florence. With the building searched and the witnesses interviewed, one avenue remained, the one thing investigators assumed no one could simply erase: a digital trail. If Brian had truly vanished, the one thing he couldn't take with him was money. Detectives were confident his accounts would surface somewhere. They never did. The medical student who disappeared from a crowded bar never touched his bank account again. His credit cards were never used, not once, in nearly 20 years. For a family desperate for any sign he might have simply walked away to start over, this was a serious problem. Starting a new life requires money, and Brian's money never moved. His cell phone told an equally strange story. and it connects directly back to Alexis and those nightly calls that almost never got answered. One night in September 2006, nearly 6 months after Brian disappeared, the phone she'd been calling every night finally did something different. It rang 3 times before going unanswered. Alexis would later say it was one of the best sounds she'd heard in months, even though no one ever picked up. Brian's wireless carrier attributed the rings to a possible computer or network glitch rather than the phone actually being powered on and in use. Separately, and just once, investigators detected a single ping from Brian's phone registering at a cell tower in Hilliard, roughly 14 miles northwest of Columbus. The phone wasn't GPS-enabled, so its precise location could never be determined, and one ping, on its own, was never enough to build a real lead from. 2 unexplained blips, months apart. Nothing more. Randy refused to let the investigation go cold on his end. He personally chased down tips, sometimes traveling out of state to investigate reported sightings. He eventually enlisted a private investigator, Don Corbett, who worked the case for the family for free, for years. Friends later said the search became Randy's life, that every reported sighting, however unlikely, represented another small chance his son might still come home. Media coverage of the case spread well beyond Columbus. At a concert in Cincinnati later that year, Pearl Jam frontman Eddie Vedder, whose band's imagery Brian wore tattooed on his own arm, paused between songs to appeal directly to the crowd for any information. Tips arrived from across the country and, eventually, from overseas. Every one led nowhere. Every lead ended at the same timestamp. 1:55 a.m. But before detectives could answer what happened to Brian, tragedy struck his own family. After Brian disappeared, tragedy struck the Shaffer family again. Randy Shaffer, who had never once stopped searching for his son, was killed outside his own home when high winds from a passing storm brought down a tree limb that struck him. He died without ever learning what happened to Brian. It left Brian's younger brother, Derek, as the only immediate family member remaining from that generation, a role he and his wife have carried through every anniversary since, periodically issuing public statements to keep his brother's name circulating. The case moved into what law enforcement calls cold case status. In 2021, the Ohio Attorney General's Bureau of Criminal Investigation released an age progression image of what Brian might look like at 42 years old, hoping a fresh visual might jog a memory somewhere. Online, the case took on a life of its own, far beyond the official police file. True crime podcasts, YouTube documentaries, and dedicated online communities have picked over every available detail for years, generating theories that range from plausible to wildly speculative. By the case's 20th anniversary in 2026, Columbus police confirmed the file remains open and is periodically reviewed, with no new breakthroughs to report publicly. Retired Sergeant John Hurst, who led the investigation for years, has said he still personally believes Brian walked out of that bar under his own power that night, even without any camera confirmation. But 2 decades of silence have changed his outlook. His personal belief now is that Brian is most likely deceased and that foul play was probably involved, a view he's careful to frame as his own, not an official department conclusion. 20 years later, investigators still disagree about what happened after 1:55 a.m. But they agree on one thing. Every serious theory begins with exactly the same missing minutes. After nearly 20 years, investigators are still left with 4 serious possibilities. Everyone explains part of the mystery. None explains all of it. If Brian chose to disappear on his own, why leave every dollar behind? Why walk away from a flight, a girlfriend he was expected to propose to, and every bank account and credit card he'd ever used, and never touch any of it again? In 2009, an attorney representing Clint Florence wrote to a private investigator, stating he believed Brian was alive and had simply chosen to vanish. It's a theory investigators have never fully closed the door on, but as Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost put it years later, Brian didn't fit the profile of someone who seemed poised to walk away from his own life. If Brian died inside that construction site beside the service door, why has nearly 20 years of searches and multiple renovations of that very building turned up nothing at all? The theory is supported by the sheer physical geography of that final frame, which places him only feet from the area. It's undermined by an exhaustive search that found no trace of him, then or since. If someone who knew him harmed him that night, how did they remove him from one of the busiest buildings in Columbus on the first weekend of spring break without a single camera or witness catching any sign of it? This theory leans heavily on Clint Florence's repeated refusal to take a polygraph and on suspicions voiced publicly by Brian's own brother and girlfriend. But Florence has never been named a suspect, and he has never been charged with any crime. And if the cameras simply missed him, could one ordinary blind spot, lasting only a few seconds, really be the reason one of America's most enduring disappearances has never been solved? It's the most mundane theory of all. It requires no foul play, no hidden exit, no dramatic explanation, just an unlucky gap in coverage at the one moment it happened to matter most. None of these theories has ever been confirmed. None has ever been eliminated with total certainty. And every one of them still ends at exactly the same unanswered question. Most missing person cases from this era share a common thread: an absence of evidence. No cameras. No named witnesses. Just a quiet gap where a person used to be. This case is the opposite. There is time-stamped video. There are named witnesses. There's a documented last sighting, precise down to the minute. And still, all of that precision collapses completely at the exact moment it matters most. The surveillance technology that should have solved this case quickly is, in some real sense, the very reason it never has. The cameras proved, beyond any doubt, that Brian was there. They never proved how, or even whether, he left. It's different, too, because of where it happened. Not a remote road at night. A crowded bar, in one of the busiest entertainment districts in the state, covered by a functioning security system, surrounded by hundreds of people, the exact kind of setting that should, in theory, have made this case easy to solve within days, not decades. Instead, nearly 20 years of searching has produced no confirmed answer to the only question that has ever mattered in this case. On any Friday night, the sidewalks outside the gateway still fill with students laughing, music spilling into the street, just as they did in 2006. For almost everyone there, it's just another night out. For one family, it never stopped being the last one. Everyone else went home that night. Brian never did. Brian's father died still asking what happened to his son. His mother never lived to ask at all. His brother still asks, publicly, every single anniversary that passes. And in Columbus, Ohio, in a building that has been renovated and repurposed more than once since 2006, the case remains exactly what it was on the morning detectives first reviewed that tape, open, unresolved, and anchored to one unbroken piece of video. The cameras captured Brian Shaffer walking into one of the busiest bars in Columbus. What they never captured was how he left. Nearly 20 years later, investigators still know exactly when Brian disappeared. They still don't know how. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Brian Randall Shaffer, please contact the Columbus Division of Police.